Good day, everybody, and welcome to the Michael and Patty Show. I'm Michael.
And I'm Patty.
Welcome to our podcast. If you haven't been here before, I and Patty are real estate agents. Patty's actually a broker. We've been doing PEI real estate full-time for over 40 years now, 7 days a week, less sleep. It's our passion. And in this podcast, we try to share with you our experiences, some drama, differences of opinion, and today we're going to be covering what it costs as far as fees, lawyers' fees, commissions to buy or sell a property in PEI. We'll be referencing to your typical residential home. We're not getting into commercial real estate and land and all that. We're just talking about a house. This is a subject that we deal with pretty well on a daily basis. We take for granted that we know the process. However, within the last week or two, it's dawned on me, and I don't know about you, Patty, that a lot of people, they don't know the process like we do, or what's involved in costs and fees and what they're going to be paying and what they're going to be netting at the end of the day when they sell their property. Because at the end of the day, all that really matters is when you sell your house, what's in your pocket in the form of a check when it closes.
Yeah, and I do find when a person makes a decision to sell their house, for whatever reason, it does provoke a lot of emotion for whatever reason that they're selling. So when you have to also dump on them at that time, here's all the legalities behind it. This is what you're responsible for. It can be overwhelming. So I think this is a great episode to do. It allows buyers and sellers to get their mind around this is what that part of the process looks like so they can get back into their why they're entering into this.
Their why.
Yeah, why am I selling? What's their motivation?
Well put. Why don't we cover the buying part and then we'll discuss the selling part. And again, this episode deals with fees. We're not going to get into the entire process, but we're going to cover some things that are really, really important when you are buying a house in PEI. That house, as of today, a typical house in PEI is $365,600. And we'll get into some more stats towards the end of this podcast. So
I was just going to say today being August 2024.
August 2024, that is correct. So if you're listening to this in the future, it's still a good episode and you want to listen to it right to the last second. And be sure to give it a rating.
Sounds good.
Okay, so one of the larger expenses is the land transfer tax. So in many provinces and states, they have a land transfer tax. Sometimes they are there's different rates depending on the value of the property. In PEI, it's a 1% land transfer tax. So if it was a $300,000 house, you would be paying $3,000 unless you're a first-time home buyer. And of course, this is all subject to change at the whim of government. But at present, I believe that's what it is. And the information we're providing to you today comes from one of our favorite lawyers. So he provided this information to us. The deed registration fee for the province is $463.65 for a purchase over $200,000, slightly less for cheaper properties. Or I would put it less expensive, but still desirable. Mortgage registration fees. If you do have a mortgage, you're going to pay between $103 and $463, depending on the type and the value of the mortgage.
And just so that they understand, deed registration is registering your name onto title, and the mortgage registration is registering your mortgage on the title as the bank has an interest now or claim on the property.
Right. Next, title insurance, which isn't mandatory, but some people elect to get, is between $150 and $500. I find title insurance protects the people holding the mortgage more than anything.
Yes, and a really important thing on title insurance, and something if you are a buyer that you might want to, if you are able to get your hands on, because I know I personally experienced this myself, is if there is a plot plan, that actually reduces the amount of your title insurance. I did not realize that. I'm one of the ones that ended up having to pay many years ago closer to the $500. I got told close to my closing date because a plot plan suddenly presented itself where the seller said they didn't have one prior to, and when I had put in my offer, that it would have probably reduced it less than half of what my title insurance. It's not a huge number, but if you're really tight with your numbers, that can be a big deal.
In your opinion, if you're buying a property in PEI, would you want title insurance?
I would recommend title insurance, yes.
And why is that?
Because as much as you assume this property has exchanged hands, whether it's only a couple times or whether it's been a dozen times, does not indicate that everything is clear. There still could be somebody who maybe was deceased 40 years ago that never had their name removed from title and it's easy for lawyers, title searchers, it can be missed. I sold a property many years ago, and it was a new lawyer on Prince Edward Island who ended up discovering the subdivision that we were selling the lot, and she was the fourth owner in there, was never an approved subdivision, and her title insurance helped her protect her from that, even though there was extra costs involved in that situation.
And there's a lot of that going on right now in the province where previously so-called approved subdivisions aren't approved because the government or whoever didn't do their job to make sure that all the conditions of the original approval were actually provided and completed. So now we're finding this coming up more and more often ever since what happened in Greenwich, which was sort of the poster child for subdivisions that really were not, but they weren't approved. I would highly recommend title insurance, and I am not an insurance advocate, but in my opinion, if you're selling a property, it should be surveyed, and there should be a plot plan if there's any structures. A plot plan is just a survey with all the little buildings on it, sometimes some more additional information. But the survey or the plot plan are based on the deed, and if the deed is invalid, they can't provide a decent survey or a plot plan. So I think it's a great idea to have. In some provinces and states, it's mandatory to have a survey or plot plan. It isn't in PEI, and I think that can cause you a lot of problems. Wouldn't you agree?
It can.
Plus, it's nice to have a survey or plot plan so you know where your actual property is, and you know that the deed is valid, because if the deed isn't valid, they can't do the survey.
Correct.
Title search. This is the item that most law offices will tell you can take an inordinate amount of time, meaning it could take several weeks. A lot of times they will tell you that their title search people are backed up. I have had deals closed that were cash deals in 17 hours. I've heard of other offices taking a month and a half to do a title search. It really comes down to who you're dealing with, and it might be a good question if you do want to close early or soon, to ask your lawyer how quickly can you close, particularly with a deal that's cash, because we don't have to worry about dealing with a mortgage company and all their expectations and conditions of that mortgage. Title search is $100 to $200. Any comments?
No.
And there is at least one law office in PEI that specializes in real estate, and one of the things they offer is super quick turnaround with their title searches, because they have multiple title searchers in their office performing these on a daily basis.
I do have a comment with regards to title search. So if you do have a tight title search time or tight closing, and you do maybe have a condition or two within the contract, it is important, like you had said, maybe contact a lawyer on the onset, at least make a connection or have a conversation, know who you're going to be using so that you have that dialogue. One of the things that I have had, and I don't know if you've had this, Michael, but many lawyers recommend is send us the offer so that we can log or get your title search booked so that you're scheduled in, versus waiting until after your 2-week condition period or 3-week condition period, dumping the file on us and giving us 2 weeks. And here we could have had 3 weeks to arrange and schedule in the title search, because they book so many every day.
And not only that, but you can add to the confusion and the noise in your life by sending a file in early that you have to deal with that doesn't even have the conditions removed.
Well, I see, and I understand that, but lawyers would rather receive it as long as they're informed that, and they're not going to charge you. I mean, that's a conversation, obviously, the buyer would have to have with their lawyer, but a lot of the lawyers that I work with say, we're not going to do anything on this file, Patty. Thank you for sending this along, or thanking my buyer clients for sending this along. We'll get a time scheduled in, and if they don't remove their conditions, then we'll just go ahead and cancel that. Nothing, no cost or expense. So again, verify that with the lawyer that you select. But I know many of the ones that I use, they won't, but they appreciate the heads up.
What I was referring to, just for clarification, is normally agents will send a file to all the lawyers, the purchaser's lawyer and the seller's lawyer, once all conditions are removed and we actually have a deal. If there's any conditions, we don't have a deal. Like to send a file over that's conditional on financing, home inspection, septic tank inspection, vendor doing a survey, and a whole pile of other things, in my opinion, just creates a lot of unnecessary paperwork. I have no issue with it. But what happens from the agent's standpoint is you get all these emails from the lawyer's office asking for all kinds of stuff, and the deal isn't even a done deal, so you end up wasting all this time corresponding with the lawyer's office for a deal that's not even complete.
Oh, I understand that.
If the purchasers and the seller want that, I've got no problem with that. But I had a deal last week where we were nowhere near complete, and I'm getting all these emails. It's like, slow down. This deal isn't even complete yet. So there's no sense getting into all this other stuff. But the vendors ended up sending the file to the lawyer in its current form, which wasn't anywhere near finished.
Yeah, the seller shouldn't be sending off.
Well, that's what he did.
Okay, well, the sellers shouldn't, because then the seller's lawyer is assuming that this is moving along and this is a done deal. A buyer's lawyer, again, the lawyers that I deal with are usually pretty good and able to say, we understand, Patty, this isn't firm yet. We will just hold on to the file, keep us posted.
And that's a good way to go. Next, legal fees. This is coming, again, from one lawyer. He's saying legal fees of approximately $1,200 to $1,500 plus HST. HST, for those that don't know this, is 15% in PEI, not 13% like it is Ontario, so I'm told. It is a federal tax, and it's paid over and above professional fees, including lawyers' fees, accounting fees, and real estate commissions. And then to that, he adds disbursements like admin fees and copy costs, which I assume is fairly negligible. And then another biggie here is, and we discussed this in prior podcasts, is if you have to go through IRAC. So IRAC, which you can find out more about at irac.pe.ca, click on Lands Protection icon over to the far left. Last time I checked, what this pertains to, if you're a non-resident of Prince Edward Island, you need to pay a 1% of purchase price fee to apply to purchase any property that's over 5 acres of land or 165 feet of frontage. And this is also accumulative. So if you already own 50 acres and 2,000 feet of frontage, you're automatically applying, even if you are under those, for a subsequent purchase. Anything you want to add?
No, unless you're within a municipality, but that's a whole other thing, and I'd rather not. Just something, if you are one of these ones who already own land on Prince Edward Island and you're wondering, do you need to go through IRAC to increase your land holdings? You could speak to your realtor, but if your realtor doesn't seem to be very clear on it, then I would be just speaking with the lawyer. Here's my situation. This is what I own. If I'm interested in purchasing this property, will I be subject to IRAC?
Or you could just call IRAC.
IRAC is great.
They're wonderful.
Yes, I agree.
Sometimes I just call them just to have a chat about the weather.
Okay.
That covers it from the buyer's side. The buyer's lawyer does the vast majority of the work, and that's why it's usually more expensive. Plus, you got the 1% land transfer fee and a bunch of other registrations and potentially IRAC.
Yeah, that is what you could expect from your legal fees when you're expecting, what is this bill going to look like? What can I plan? I usually tell my clients about 3 to 5% of purchase price. If they can have that amount, they should be able to cover all their closing cost fees. So that's just a rule of thumb that I give. The other thing just to be aware of, that doesn't include some of your fees like your home inspection and septic and anything else as it pertains to the sale. These are just kind of like a nicely clumped in, this is what your legal fees would be and what the breakdown looks like.
We're also not covering if, and the purchaser has this option to get a septic tank pump, which could be $300 to $500 or $800 with an inspection, depending on who you're using. Maybe getting a plot plan or a survey done, maybe getting soil tests done for maybe they're adding to the property or changing it. Environmental assessments, home inspections you covered. And there's probably deposits. So if you're a new person to PEI, when you're getting electricity, you may have to put a deposit down. I'm not sure if propane and oil and all these guys or fuel suppliers are doing that, but you also want to probably budget for deposits as well if you're a new customer.
Yeah, that's 100%. And I do think places that provide propane or oil do require a deposit as well. So just something to give you the heads up for.
From a seller's point, what are the expenses? I'll let you cover that.
The sellers, so the bulk, as you can see, of the closing costs are at the buyer's expense. They're going to be the ones that are going to have to really plan and make sure that they have the closing costs. From a seller's point of view, it's significantly less because you're not the one having to register names and
as far as legal fees.
Right. Registering names, land transfer tax, deed registration, title search, that is all done. The bulk of all of that is done by the buyers. So what the sellers are responsible for is the disbursement of the funds. So the seller's lawyer will be doing a list of adjustments. It's right in your agreement of purchase and sale. If the seller, and I'll just kind of go through, let's assume they have propane or their heat source is oil. The seller's responsible to top that up and bring in their top-up slip or email it to the lawyer. And the buyer is responsible for, a full tank of oil. So they're essentially purchasing a full tank of fuel, whatever that may be. So that is part of your closing costs. The legal fees are approximately $1,100 to $1,300 plus HST. So that'll be a part of it. If you've paid your property taxes for the year, as a seller's lawyer, they will, on a prorate basis per day, how much did the property taxes for that year cost you? Did you overpay, so therefore the buyer owes you X amount of dollars, or did you not have to make that third installment for the year, because we typically pay our property taxes in 3 installments? Did you not have to make, or did you not make that third installment, but yet you still owe X amount of dollars? So as a seller's lawyer, that your lawyer's responsible for coming up with who owes who for the property taxes, the fuel adjustment, make sure that you are compensated. They make sure that you do receive the funds when at closing. If there is any issues with title search, or if there's any issues at closing, having the 2 lawyers involved is very, very important. They will make sure that they do any, mediation between the 2 parties. One may not have thought the house was clean. The sellers, felt that the house was satisfactory. Your lawyer will represent you and hopefully be able to just say, no, this is the way it is, or come up with whatever some mutual agreed upon. So that's very, very important, because I do have sellers, and I don't know, I'm sure you have, Michael, who feel, why do I need a lawyer? The buyer's lawyer has to do everything. And, I don't need a lawyer. What do you say to them?
I think it depends on the transaction, but one saying does come to mind, and that saying is those that represent themselves have a fool for a client. I think lawyers overall add an abundance of knowledge, skill, and experience, and a lot of times they will pick up on things, just like an experienced real estate agent, that you never even thought of, and after the transaction's done, it's too late. So for the sake of saving, according to this lawyer, you no more than $1,000, $2,000, I think I would probably say that that's probably money well spent.
I would agree. They are also responsible, so whatever the real estate fees are, they make sure that, and the seller doesn't have to do this, but as part of the proceeds of the sale, the real estate fees, which are subject to HST, are taken care of. So they get paid out. The seller's lawyer is responsible to make sure that's been taken care of. We just call it a disbursement of funds. The mortgage satisfaction, so removing the mortgage or, paying out the mortgage, according to these numbers here, that is $77.25. So again, not something that you as a seller have to deal with. The lawyer will look after all of that. It just says, of these, only legal fees will vary between lawyers, and even then, not usually by more than $1,000 to $2,000. It is very important, and again, I understand what you're saying, Michael. It depends on the situation, but I recommend all my sellers have representation, make sure that they don't miss some of these little things, and that it just makes for a smoother closing, and hopefully there's no issues, no surprises.
So what would I pay the real estate agent in the form of a commission? Like, the commissions are shared. So when you're going back to the buyer side, unlike the states, they now have to pay for their buyer's representation. We'll see how that works out for them. In PEI, typically what happens is the seller, or the vendors as we usually call them, they pay the commission, and then the commission is dispersed typically on an equity basis, but not always, to the buying and the selling brokerage, and then they disperse it to the buying and the selling agent, and there's a bunch of different stuff that goes on there. But if I'm selling my house, we're sticking to houses at the moment, what should I expect to pay in the form of a commission? And before Patty gets into this was a hot topic with both of us all this week, because Patty said we can't talk about commissions. You can talk about commissions. What you can't do is you can't collude or there has to be, the Competition Act provides setting fixed commission rates prohibits setting fixed commission rates among real estate professionals. Commissions must be negotiable between the agent and their client, which they absolutely are.
No, and they are. It's whatever they mutually agree them to be.
Right. So when I look at MLS, what do I typically see houses listed for on the island?
That's a good question, Michael. How I answer that, and this is where Michael and I have been kind of going back to back. I'm going to answer this question my way, and you can answer it your way, because we still just, we don't, which is the benefit of listening to these episodes. We still do not have 100% agreement, but that's okay. So my answer to this question, what you can expect to pay for real estate fees and how they're done on Prince Edward Island, is it is a percentage of purchase price. We don't have like some other provinces where there's a sliding scale based on whatever the number is. It's usually a percentage of what that purchase price is plus HST, or, and I know for myself, my brokerage, which Michael and I are with two different companies, which is why I feel we have to be very mindful in how we address this topic. In my company, if it's under a certain price point, we do offer a flat fee to ensure that the agents involved, so it's a flat fee plus HST, so that the agents involved are compensated for their time and effort in putting together a transaction. And those typically apply for land, because there are some really lower priced pieces of land. So that is how I would answer the question. You go right ahead, Michael.
It's very easy just to Google what's the average commission rates in North America, and it will provide you with an answer. When I look at listings on the MLS, and this is all public information, this is on many of the sheets that the real estate agents hand out optionally, depending on what report they provided to you. I see 5%, I see 6%, I see a little less than that. Sometimes you'll see 4%, sometimes you'll see more. What Patty's talking about, the scale, you can do that. It's just not, I've not seen that done here too often. I have done commission agreements where they are subject to the selling price, subject to time, but those are all commercial contracts involving substantive properties or substantial properties. But basically, this is a conversation you want to have with your agent, and you want to ask them what they charge, and you also want to ask them what they provide. So we'll leave it at that, unless you want to add to that.
No, I'm good.
Okay, here's another biggie, and then we're going to move on to the stats, is Canada Revenue Agency income tax withholding for non-Canadian residents. Now, that's an exciting subject, Patty. Do you want to explain that?
As a non-Canadian, when you're selling properties, we can use U.S. A non-Canadian, if they have a land holdings, if they own property, and I'll just reference Prince Edward Island because that's where my knowledge base and where all my years experience comes from. If they want to sell the property, they have to satisfy their tax obligation. If they've owned the property for 20 years, this residential property, did they use it? Did they make any income from it? Because that'll determine how much of the CRA will insist that the lawyer gets held in trust at the lawyer's office, how much that is. Basically, if it's just a residential property and you were using it as a cottage or you're home away from home, it is 25% is what they're going to withhold until you file what is called a clearance certificate. And then once your tax obligations, once it's determined what your capital gains are for that property, once that has been satisfied, whatever is left or remaining then will be paid back. I always tell my clients, I know typically they say 3 to 6 months. I've actually had an American client who did not get their proceeds until almost a year later. So if I do have a non-Canadian client, I give them the heads up on this so I don't create false expectations that they're going to get their money within 3 to 6 months. Michael, do you have?
Generally speaking, well, first, let me preface this by saying neither Patty or I are accountants. Correct. So this information should come from your accountant. The information I have in front of me, which is like a whole page from a lawyer, you still want to consult an accountant. So typically when we sell properties that are owned by non-residents, non-Canadians, they do have to go through this process. And the general rule I find with Canada Revenue Agency is if they want something from you, it's due in a week, and they send you a nasty letter all in uppercase screaming at you. But if they want to provide anything to you, it's usually 6 to 8 months, maybe a year. Last thing I did with CRA, it took me almost a year to get this. It was like one little word they had to change an initial. It took me a year to get that back. So generally, they're not too expedient with this stuff. With all due respect, they probably have multiple check systems and checksums and whatever reconciliation processes to make sure everything's correct. Standard holdback, like Patty said, and what this lawyer is saying is 25%, but I understand that could be a bigger percentile based on the entity if it's a commercial operation or a corporation, could it not?
Yes, if it is something that produced an income, it could go up to 50%. So what does that mean to a seller who's a non-Canadian resident looking to sell? You can sell your property if you absolutely. This isn't, when do you file a clearance certificate? I always advise, so here's my spiel to
within 10 days, it says here.
Of closing.
Right.
10 days of closing. How I start the process is, hi, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, so you're looking to sell your Canadian property.
Real name?
No, it is not.
What if you had a seller, their actual name was Mr. and Mrs. Seller?
I will actually, too bad we still don't have the old phone books because I could look that up and see if there is a last name of that, but that is dating me. I just let them know you will be subject to a 25% tax withholding. What they're going to be looking for is, and I would already know this information because I would have done my due diligence and research, you've owned the property for, let's say, 10 years. If there's any expenses and costs that you have endured and paid out, start collecting your receipts and statements now instead of waiting until close to closing when you've got all this chaos and you're trying to figure out, I got to get my stuff out of the house, I have this, I've got to be able to courier, I need documents signed. When you have all of that and the lawyer or the accountant, because you weren't informed right on the onset, you need to speak to an accountant and you do need to speak to a lawyer. They will properly advise you. I'm only giving you a little summary and directing you to what you could expect. But if you want to reduce the amount of the taxes that you're going to owe, because again, if it's 5, 10, 20 years, there is going to be capital gains owned on that. You could bring it down by just spending a little bit of time. Maybe you have your invoices and statements, in Canada and you've got to plan a trip up there in order to get them. Or maybe you're in Canada and it's like you contacted your realtor and said, hey, I want to sell my property today. And then this all gets dumped on you. If you hadn't planned it properly, you could be putting yourself at a tax disadvantage. So if you call while you're still at home and that's where you have your income statement, like your invoices and your receipts, start putting that together right on the onset. It will hopefully alleviate a lot of stress when the time comes to actually file your clearance certificate. That does have to be within 10 days of the completion date or your closing. So once it closes, where that money goes is that 25% is held in trust with your lawyer. Your lawyer is obligated to hold on to that until, your accountant, your clearance certificate has been processed and CRA makes the tax determination as to how much is owed before the rest of the funds are released.
I would strongly suggest this process be handled with an accountant's assistance.
Oh, 100%.
I would not partake this on my own, and in some cases, I do know lawyers that have filled out the income tax forms. I wouldn't suggest getting that done by a lawyer, with all due respect to the lawyers. I'd probably have an accountant do it, because it also does add more credibility, because CRA is all about credibility and being able to prove the statements you're making, the numbers you're providing. They just want to make sure that what you're providing looks factual. And if it's backed by an accountant, it might have a little more credence or seem a little more credible, certified, whatever you want to call it. In an ideal world, if you haven't purchased property in PEI yet, open up a spreadsheet and keep track of all your expenses pertaining to that property, including airfare, gas, mileage, wear and tear on your vehicle, which would play into the mileage expense, meals, hotels, cutting grass, fixing roofs, hiring plumbers, getting anything done pertaining to that property, because you could use that potentially down the road in accordance to CRA guidelines and whatever your accountant says to defer some of the capital gains, but most people never do that.
That's actually really, really good advice, Mike.
Isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Well, if there's only one podcast you've ever listened to, one episode, this is it. You don't need to listen to any more until you give us a star rating and some feedback. Let's get to the stats and close her down. As we know in real estate and PEI, you could take the entire year off with the exception of July and August and probably do fairly well as a real estate agent. The market seems to be directly proportional to the color of the grass. When it becomes green and all the flowers are up, everybody and their brother wants to list their property for sale, and everybody and their brother that's looking to buy property does so in that same time frame. The tourists look at the weather and they adjust their calendars accordingly, and then they call us, and we're too busy to help them, so they find somebody else. I'm just kidding.
Yes.
So what we've seen sort of doom and gloom series of stats all this year where listings are down, sales are down, even the values were down. This month is completely different. This month meaning July 24. And keep in mind, the biggest challenge with PEI real estate is it's not a big market, so it doesn't take much to skew the stats. But according to these stats, home sales are up 9.1%. Market balance has changed ever so slightly. It was balanced before, so you didn't have an advantage as a buyer or a seller. Now it's slightly tilted in favor of sellers, which means the sellers have a little bit of leverage, but not too much. Don't let it go to your head. New listings are up by 10.2%. And again, when we look at that stat, it's really kind of ridiculous. It says 364 listings last year, and this year we have 401. Woohoo.
Yes.
We're not talking like this isn't Toronto where you have a difference between 35,000 and 56,000 listings, right?
Yes.
We're talking 364 versus 401. And the benchmark price is unchanged. The benchmark is the price of what would be deemed to be a typical house, which is $365,600, and that's unchanged compared to the same month last year's, so values have not gone up in July. Anything you'd like to add?
So when we get the stats, yes, this is August 2024, so all the information that you're hearing today is based on the way the business, the cost and expense for legal fees, the same with the stats. They're based on today being August 2024. We have to wait until the end of the month. So we have to wait till the end of, in this case, July in order to get our stats, for the month previous. So these stats, what they're doing is they're comparing July 2024 to July 2023. And about the first or second week of September, we will be releasing what are August's stats. So that's what these numbers are coming from. If we're throwing out some numbers and what are they comparing this to? What is this about? Just so that you're aware, we compare on a month-to-month basis. Where was the market last year this exact same time?
And of course, the best sources for stats are always CMHC, Canadian Home Mortgage Corporation, and Canadian Real Estate Association, which pulls their data from our PEI Real Estate Association. Have a great day. Thank you very, very much for listening. And again, if you like this content, be sure to give us a rating and some feedback on whatever podcast listener software you use. And we hope to see you back soon. Patty?
Yeah. And if you have anything that you would like us to talk about, send it along to either Michael or myself, and we'll be sure to cover it in a future episode. Have a great day.